He did not sell land. He did not sell titles. He sold a woman. Before the British crown ever touched his head, a deal was already signed in silence. A future king would trade marriage for money and dignity for survival. This is where the story of George IV of the House of Hanover, ruler of the British monarchy, truly begins. Not with a coronation, not with applause, but with debt. As Prince of Wales, George lived like a man who believed consequences were for other people. Gambling drained fortunes in single nights. Lavish banquets followed mornings of excess. Palaces were redesigned not for statecraft, but for pleasure. His image glittered, but behind the silk and velvet was a simple truth. He was broke. By the time he reached his early 30s, the heir to the British throne was financially ruined. Creditors circled, scandals whispered, and Parliament was watching closely. They did not see a charming prince. They saw a danger. A man who could not control his appetite could not be trusted with an empire. George asked to be saved. Parliament agreed, but rescue always comes with conditions. The debts would be paid, the reputation would be repaired, the scandal would be buried. In return, George would do what he despised most. He would marry a woman he did not love, did not choose, and did not respect, not as a husband, but as collateral. This was not romance. This was a transaction. A bride selected to stabilize the monarchy. A marriage designed to produce an heir. A public performance meant to convince the nation that order still existed at the top. George accepted the terms. In that moment, he crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. He proved that even the most sacred bond could be reduced to currency when power was at risk. The crown was protected, the money flowed, and the cost was transferred to someone else. This is not the story of a bad marriage. It is the story of a king who learned that survival was easier when someone else paid the price. And in the next part, we will witness how this bargain exploded into one of the most humiliating royal weddings in British history. If you want to uncover the darkest royal scandals history tried to bury, subscribe to the channel now. George IV did not fall in love like an ordinary man. He fell in love like a liability. Maria Fitzherbert was not royal. She was Catholic, and under the Royal Marriages Act, any union with her was not just forbidden. It was treasonous to the future of the crown. Yet George went forward anyway. In 1785, in a quiet ceremony hidden from the court, the press, and the law itself, George married Maria in secret. No witnesses of power, no blessing of Parliament, no approval from his father, King George III. Only a vow spoken in defiance. To Maria, it was a sacred union. To George, it was something else entirely. Because even as he called her his wife, he made sure the marriage could never protect her. The document was hidden. The witnesses were chosen carefully. The legal loopholes were intentional. George ensured that when the time came, the crown could deny everything. And when rumors began to leak, when whispers of a Catholic wife reached Parliament, George did not stand beside her. He erased her. Through intermediaries, he swore publicly that no marriage had ever taken place. He allowed lawyers to argue technicalities. He let the state declare the woman he loved as nothing more than a rumor. Maria remained faithful. George remained silent. This was the first transaction of his life. Love in exchange for secrecy, honor in exchange for survival. And it worked. Parliament looked away. The king pretended ignorance. Society accepted the lie because it was convenient to do so. George learned something vital in those months. The crown did not demand virtue, it demanded usefulness. and usefulness could be negotiated. As his debts mounted and his reputation collapsed, George understood that the next marriage would not be chosen by his heart, but by his creditors. The secret marriage taught him that vows could be broken without consequence, as long as power benefited. Maria Fitzherbert lived the rest of her life in a strange limbo. Married but unacknowledged, loyal but disposable, she was the woman who proved that the crown could take everything and give nothing in return. For George, the lesson was complete. Marriage was not a bond, it was leverage. And soon, the nation would demand that leverage be used. In the next part, the secret would collide with spectacle. A public wedding would be arranged. A princess would be sacrificed. And the lie that saved George in private would begin to rot him in public. The wedding day arrived without anticipation. No sense of beginning, only procedure. George IV of the House of Hanover stood before the altar dressed as a groom, yet carrying none of the weight of a husband. His posture was rigid, his gaze unfocused. His presence felt detached from the ritual unfolding around him. Those closest to him noticed first. The smell of alcohol was unmistakable. He had been drinking since early morning, not to celebrate, not to calm nerves, but to dull something deeper. His movements were slow, his expression vacant, a future king numbing himself before a ceremony he did not believe in. Across from him stood Caroline of Brunswick. She waited in full view of the court, adorned as a bride should be. The symbols were correct, the setting was flawless, the performance was ready, but the man beside her was absent. When George finally looked at her, there was no softness, no attempt at charm. His reaction was immediate and visible. He turned his head away. He asked for brandy. The ceremony halted briefly so the groom could drink. No one intervened. The priest waited. The courtiers looked down. Silence filled the space where dignity should have been. The vows began. They were spoken quickly, stripped of emotion, reduced to sound. Hands touched without warmth. The kiss was avoided entirely. The words bound them in law, but nothing in the room suggested connection. This was not a marriage. It was a performance carried by obligation. The audience outside heard music and bells. They believed they were witnessing a union. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, restrained, almost embarrassed. George did not smile. He did not look at his bride again. He treated the ceremony as something to endure, not to honor. What made the moment unsettling was not cruelty, but indifference. Royal marriages had long survived without love. But this was different. George did not even pretend. He allowed the emptiness to be seen. He let the nation watch a man submit without surrendering his inner refusal. The ritual concluded. Applause followed. The crown moved forward. But something had been exposed. The monarchy could stage unity. It could command attendance. It could enforce vows. What it could not do was create meaning. By the end of the day, a wedding had taken place. A queen had been declared. A future had been announced. Yet the groom had never truly arrived. And that absence would soon demand a reckoning. The night demanded silence. What it received was disgrace. When the celebrations ended and the doors closed, the palace expected a simple illusion. A groom retiring with his bride, a ritual completed away from witnesses, something unspoken but necessary for the dignity of the crown. Instead, chaos followed. George did not go to his wife. He wandered. He drank. He lost control of his body before he ever entered the marriage bed. Servants later recalled the sound first, a heavy collapse, a dull impact against stone. When they found him, he was unconscious, sprawled beside the fireplace, his body half inside the hearth, reeking of alcohol. This was not rumor. This was memory. Men who had served kings their entire lives stood frozen, unsure whether to lift him or look away. No order was given, no explanation offered. The future monarch lay motionless, reduced to a spectacle of excess and collapse. Caroline waited alone. No knock came, no message followed, no apology arrived. The silence stretched through the corridors, thick with embarrassment. A royal household trained to protect appearances suddenly had nothing to protect. This was not cruelty planned. It was humiliation exposed. By morning, whispers had already begun. Not from enemies, not from rivals, from inside the palace itself. Those who witnessed the scene could not unsee it. A king-to-be who could not even perform the most basic role expected of him. The marriage had not failed privately. It had failed in full view of servants, guards, and courtiers. George awoke hours later with no recollection worth defending. The fireplace ash clung to his clothes. His body carried the evidence his memory refused to keep. Nothing was said publicly. Nothing needed to be. Caroline was expected to endure, to remain composed, to carry the weight of a night that stripped her of dignity without giving her even a story to tell. The palace returned to routine. Breakfast was served. Curtains were opened. Orders were given. But something had cracked beyond repair. This was the moment the marriage became irredeemable. Not because of absence, not because of rejection, but because the crown itself had been dragged into farce. A royal wedding night had ended with a king unconscious in a fireplace and a bride abandoned to silence. No proclamation could erase it. No ceremony could correct it. In a single night, the monarchy learned a brutal truth. Power could force a wedding, but it could not prevent disgrace. And disgrace, once witnessed, never truly disappears. There was only one night. Not of love, of obligation. It came after silence. After distance had already settled between them. No tenderness preceded it. No closeness followed. George entered her room without warmth, without words, and without intention beyond duty. By morning, the door closed again, and this time it did not reopen. That single night was enough. An heir was born, and with the heir, Caroline's usefulness ended. From that moment on, her position shifted quietly but decisively. She was no longer a partner in appearance, nor even an inconvenience to be tolerated nearby. She became excess. Invitations stopped. Her presence at court was reduced, then questioned, then discouraged. Rooms once prepared for her were reassigned. Her name faded from conversations that mattered. Power did not banish her publicly. It erased her gradually. Soon, the suggestion arrived that she should leave Britain, not as punishment, but as courtesy. Travel would spare everyone discomfort. Distance would preserve dignity. The language was polite. The intent was final. Caroline left the country, but she did not leave control behind. George ensured that money continued to reach her, an allowance generous enough to appear benevolent, restrictive enough to demand obedience. Acceptance meant compliance. Resistance meant attention. She was watched. Not openly, not officially, but constantly. The machinery of the state followed her across borders. Servants were questioned. Companions reported. Letters were noted. Her movements mapped and interpreted through suspicion. Every laugh was misread. Every friendship scrutinized. Every moment of independence treated as provocation. This was no longer marriage. It was management. Caroline was allowed to exist only within limits she did not set. She could travel, but not belong. She could speak, but not be believed. She could live, but never without an invisible audience. George did not need her presence. He needed her contained. What was collected around her was not truth. It was material, fragments of behavior, stripped of context, saved for a future moment when justification might be required. Scandal does not begin loudly. It is prepared quietly. Caroline sensed the pressure, but not its full shape. She believed she had been discarded. She did not yet understand that she was being archived. Her life reduced to reports, her character reduced to risk. The woman once presented as queen was now a liability to be controlled, a reminder of a bargain already paid for and regretted. The crown had taken what it needed and moved on. But power never forgets what it fears. George had learned that marriages could be erased, truths could be delayed, and reputations could be dismantled with patience. What remained was timing. And when the moment came, the evidence would already be waiting. This was not a husband abandoning a wife. This was authority preparing revenge for an old debt it believed had never been fully settled. George did not allow the past to fade. He summoned it into the open. What had once been managed in silence was now dragged before the entire country, not to resolve a marriage, not to seek truth, but to cleanse the image of the king. The target was clear, so was the stage. A public trial was announced, not of policy, not of treason, but of the Queen herself. Caroline was summoned back to Britain not as a wife but as an accused figure. Her return was framed as necessity. In reality, it was theater, a spectacle designed to prove that the crown had been wronged and that the king was the victim. The charges were carefully constructed: moral corruption, improper conduct, foreign scandal. Evidence gathered over years was presented not as context, but as indictment. Witnesses were brought forward, their words rehearsed, their credibility flexible. This was not justice, it was choreography. George remained distant from the proceedings. He did not need to appear cruel. The institutions spoke for him. Parliament debated. Lawyers argued. The press amplified every accusation. The country was told to watch, and it did. But something unexpected happened. The people did not see a dangerous woman. They saw a discarded wife being sacrificed to preserve a crown. They saw power attempting to erase its own embarrassment by crushing a weaker figure. Crowds gathered outside, not to cheer the king, but to support the accused. Caroline became a symbol she never asked to be, a woman sold for stability, exiled for convenience, now publicly humiliated for image repair. Pamphlets circulated, songs were sung, streets filled with voices that refused to echo the will of the palace. For the first time, the monarchy felt resistance not from rivals, but from its own people. Inside the chamber, George held advantage. The rules favored him. The process was designed to succeed. On paper, the king was winning. Outside, he was losing something far more dangerous: trust. The longer the trial continued, the clearer it became that this was not about guilt. It was about control, about a king attempting to rewrite a personal failure as a moral crusade. Caroline endured. She did not collapse. She did not flee. Her composure became defiance, her presence a quiet accusation against the machinery trying to dismantle her. When the proceedings finally ended, no clear verdict emerged. The charges dissolved into political compromise. The crown retreated without triumph. George had achieved what he needed formally, but the damage was done. He had exposed the lengths he would go to protect himself. He had turned a marriage into a national wound. He had forced the country to choose, and the country had spoken. The king stood intact in law, but diminished in the hearts of his people. He had won on paper and lost the nation. George survived. That alone was the victory. The crown remained on his head. The machinery of power continued to move at his command. The titles stayed intact. The institutions obeyed. On the surface, nothing had collapsed. History records this as success, but survival is not the same as honor. What George secured was position, not reverence. Authority, not belief. The nation learned that its king could endure scandal, manipulate law, and bend institutions without ever repairing the fracture beneath them. The throne was saved, but it was no longer admired. From that moment on, George ruled with distance between himself and the people. Not rebellion, not open hatred, something colder, a quiet withdrawal of respect. He was obeyed, but no longer trusted. The rituals continued. Portraits were painted. Ceremonies unfolded. Applause was offered when required. Yet beneath the pageantry, something essential had been spent. A monarchy does not rest only on crowns and laws. It rests on the belief that power carries restraint, that authority is paired with dignity, that a king represents more than himself. George had broken that illusion. He had treated marriage as leverage, reputation as currency, a human life as collateral, and in doing so, he taught the nation a lesson it would not forget. That power could protect itself, but not redeem itself. There was no dramatic fall, no exile, no tragic end to close the story neatly. That was the cruelest part. George lived on as king, and the cost followed him silently. People remembered. They did not riot. They did not overthrow. They simply adjusted their expectations downward. The crown became something endured rather than honored, a symbol that functioned, but no longer inspired. In the end, George proved something devastatingly simple. A man can bargain his way out of disgrace. He can survive exposure. He can keep everything that matters on paper. But the one thing that cannot be negotiated is respect. Once it is sold, once it is traded for convenience and control, it does not return. Not with time, not with authority, not with victory. The throne was preserved, the reverence was not. If you want more stories where power survives but dignity does not, where history hides its darkest bargains behind ceremony, subscribe to the channel and stay with us.